I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. I thought it was really good. But I'm missing, I'm saving my dessert for when Jared starts speaking. So in this session, we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about think. We're going to learn more about the design thinking, some ideation techniques that we can use to come up with cool ideas for apps. And then we're going to talk about design. We're going to basically go through an entire application, and we're going to see how we took some of the design decisions that helped us put together that application. This will basically take all that foundational information that I shared with you in the morning, right? All these different concepts about these controls and those other controls, etc. We're going to put all those together in a single application, which is always a great way to learn, a better way to learn when we go into real world scenarios. So, a lot of people have been asking, where can we get these slide decks? Where can we get these materials? And you can get them here. I have them in my blog, so feel free to go there. I have a post with the materials of today, including Jared's source files. Oh, thank you. That's very important. Thank you. There you go. So you can get the index from today, and also the source project that Jared is going to be putting together later in the day. And as a reminder, here are some of the Twitter aliases. We know it's always important to stay in touch. So we're right there with the Windows Phone Design Studio. So if you ever have a question or a comment, feedback, anything that you guys want, feel free to drop us a tweet, and you can be sure you're talking straight to the product team. The Add WP Design team is the Twitter alias for the Windows Phone Design Team alias, and that's where you will usually get notes about events, new releases, announcements, new resources, etc., etc. Jared Potter. Is that? Oh, that's correct. Thank you for the note. We don't want to miss Jared. Jared T. Potter. Thanks for the note. Okay, I'll show this later. Let's start. Oh, so I know you were about to take a picture and I caught you. But okay, think. I'm going to focus particularly on the first two, which are design-driven process. Design-driven process, we're going to talk more about that, and some ideation techniques, some fun ideation techniques that you can use with your team to come up with cool ideas for apps. So let's talk about the design-driven process. This is a quote that I like a lot. There is no alternative to no design. There's only good or bad design. A lot of times when we start developing or creating an idea for an application, a lot of times people say, well, if I decide not to invest on design, that's one less problem, right? But the reality is no, design is always there. It's whether we want to make it good or bad. Design is unavoidable. Of a choice to do it good, in a good or in a bad way. Do really good design today, and this is something that has been discussed for many years now, but it really makes a lot of sense today, whether you work on your own or whether you have a team. It is very important to keep a well-balanced, a healthy balance group of people and talent that have what we usually refer to as the left side of the brain, right side of the brain type of people, right? People more functional, rational, and sequential, and logical perhaps, and people that are focused perhaps more on the essence, like being emotional and intuitive and spontaneous, etc., etc. And whether you are working on your own or in a team, in order to create successful digital experiences, you need to understand both aspects. The times when software was only about traditional are long gone, we think. Also, the time where being a graphic designer who could create pretty designs, I think those days are long gone as well. It really is about being the best designer you can be and the best developer you can be by understanding each other's world. And I think Jared is actually a good example of someone who has that type of hybrid profile, someone who can understand both worlds. Now, it doesn't mean that developers have to convert themselves into designers and designers into developers, but understanding each other's worlds will help you collaborate better and create better experiences. Sorry about the sound that's breaking out still. So talking about design, when I use the word design, I'm using the word design in the broader sense of conceptualizing and executing on an idea. I'm not just talking about visual design or making things pretty. I'm talking about designing an experience, a user experience. And when it comes to user experiences are made out of different elements. One of them is aesthetics. It's certainly aesthetics, beauty, how great things look, matter. Here are a few examples, right? So aesthetic-driven design. Smart is this, right? Graphic designer, packaging industrial designer comes up with an idea to abstract something that from the real world into packaging in a beautiful way. It's something that engages the eye and just, you know, it's kind of delightful in the way that it communicates a particular concept. It's aesthetic-driven design. Here's another kind of very smart metaphor, aesthetic-driven, right? What do we do when we feel we're cold? We wear a sweater, right? So if the ice cream is cold, why not put it a sweater, a little sweater? So I thought that was kind of cute, and it's just kind of a smart way, again, to solve from an aesthetic point of view design. But design is also function. It's also about breaking through and coming up with cool ideas for solving functionality. So for example, this conceptual design from Easy Drink, right? We have all drunk water from a bottle of water, right? But these guys thought, well, we can improve this design that everyone takes for granted, and we can actually move the neck of the bottle, rotate it 45 degrees, and we think that will bring a huge number of benefits. And so the designers go ahead and they start explaining what benefits they will bring. Something like this, which is so true, right? So by doing this, you know, less water will be spilled. And notice also the talent of the designer to showcase kind of what the values of doing this design will bring. Also even for drinking, right? Now in theory you don't have to move the bottle or rotate it so much, probably much less, but just kind of start showing how functionality, not necessarily aesthetics, but functionality can also drive value to an experience. And then of course comes the experience itself. And here there's this interesting the fruit peeler or that we have on the left side of your screen is what we've seen for many, many years, right? A few years ago, this company named OXO came up with this other one that we have on the right. In an interview, the designer of this fruit peeler revealed that the reason why this fruit peeler became the best-selling around the world, and now it's kind of the standard to have that type of rubber-based grip on the sides of the fruit peeler. A lot of people thought, well, maybe that grip is actually giving it a better handling to the user. And it turns out that the designer said it's really, you know, it's not much, you don't get a much better grip with this one versus this one. What he said was calling the attention of users here was that the feeling of touching this rubber, being soft and getting into the shape of the fingers, it just made the element felt more part of the hand of the user. So it wasn't even necessarily that it was a tougher grip or better grip, it was just the feeling of holding that particular object. And I can totally relate to that, like it's something that just feels good in holding. And another interesting example is a Starbucks, at least in the US. Are there a lot of Starbucks here in Denmark? Good for you maybe. Still defending the origin. So in the US, Starbucks is a big deal, right? And the thing about Starbucks, and the reason why they are so successful and they achieve, you know, or they have people pay $6, $7 for a cup of coffee, is because they understand that what they are selling is not the coffee itself. They're selling the experience of going to their stores and, you know, sitting down in an amazing environment with nice music, and you get the coffee. And a lot of people call Starbucks their second place or their third place after home and office. Everyone has favorite Starbucks, and the reason is they accept that the real product they sell is not the coffee but the experience. So when it comes to design, you really have to think about all these three different dimensions. It's about aesthetics, about functions, and it's about the end-to-end user experience. Now with this graphic, we usually try to communicate what is the value of having a design-driven process. This is a design-driven process, a process that starts by defining requirements for the application, allowing yourself and your team to explore those requirements and the solutions, defining a concept, refining that concept, and then executing. What we do with this curve is we bring all the risk, or most of the risk of the project, forward in time. We can explore, we allow ourselves to explore the experience and the app from the beginning, and we reduce the risk when it comes to execution and development. I'm sure we have all been in the case where we've been coding or programming for, I don't know, 2 or 3 months, and we finally output a prototype, and the prototype goes to the users, and users don't find it easy to use that particular feature. Or the marketing team starts saying, well, we don't really need that feature anymore. So a lot of those type of gaps and pitfalls that can happen by not planning and not allowing yourself to explore your concept, the concept of your application, can be solved if you kick off by doing a design-driven process. Let's talk more about how you do that part of the process, especially defining your concept. There are 3 key filters that we think a lot about in the studio when it comes to prioritizing features and coming up with ideas for what comes in Windows Phone. These are business, technical, and experience filters. So business is how viable is this feature or this product, in your case. Now you can use this at the application level or at a specific little feature level. How technically feasible is this feature or this application? Do I have all the resources that are needed? Are the right APIs exposed out there that I can leverage? But also, how durable is this particular feature or application? And this is a particular area that sometimes we forget. We tend to focus on how easy we can sell it, how technically feasible it is, how desirable it is also very important. And you can actually use these 3 filters to pass through all your features or your application ideas. And if you feel or you realize that one of your features is kind of weak in one of these 3 areas, chances are that feature could be perhaps cut or postponed to a future version. You want, especially with phone applications that are very focused and well targeted, to be very strong on all these 3 areas. This is a little bit of the process that we follow in the studio to create the experience. We're basically talking the process that goes from think to make, allowing designers and developers to explore a particular solution, defining the concept before building it, just exploring the concept with the use of sketches and storyboards and paper prototypes and then digital prototypes, and then allowing that concept to get refined until that starts getting to be produced. Now, maybe this would be a good time to give you like just a quick description or yeah, I guess a quick tour of how the design studio, the Windows Phone Design Studio works and is structured. And maybe Jared, I don't know if you know, want to give us a quick tour of maybe starting with like my case, Chef Fong's type of side of the road, and then to your team.
Yeah, at Microsoft for a long time there was just a creative director that worked on the team. And there still is a creative director on the Windows Phone design team. It's Albert Schum, who oversees everything that's going on. But now we've sort of split out into more specific skill sets. So we now have a visual director, which is Jeff Vong and Jay Park. Sorry, oh, I guess I wasn't speaking. Jeff Vong, if you ever used Media Center or Zune HD, he's one of the few people in the design studio who are kind of old school Microsoft, but sort of set the tone for the stuff that's coming out in Windows Phone. So he's sort of our visual lead. Jeff Arnold is head of the motion team. So we have a team that's specifically dedicated to sort of response, the milliseconds on the phone, and all of that sort of motion work. Then we also have a design research team, which is really cool. It's the first time in my career I get to work day-to-day right next to a team that is literally putting things in the lab right in front of users. So we say, hey, here's a really good idea. I'm going to make this or build it or throw it up in Blend, have it done in a couple hours, and they can be testing it by the next day sometimes. And sometimes we even do rapid iterative testing where we're kind of cranking out various versions of something in like an hourly basis and putting it in front of users. And then my team, which is the design integration team, is dedicated to making pixel perfect, motion perfect UI on the device. So my team takes all of the visual guides, takes all of the motion guides, and we review every single, in Mango, 867 screens, I believe, that were on the Windows Phone, and make sure that it works in every orientation and rotation and with motion and going from this screen to that screen. So that's sort of how our design studio is structured right now. And you're one of the visual designers, correct? Or
Officially
interaction?
Speaking, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm kind of doing more evangelism these days, but yeah, I officially fit with more of the visual designers. But one of the reasons we really wanted to have Jared here with us is because when I joined the team, I realized that one of the things that made a huge difference with this user experience team in Microsoft and other traditional design teams in Microsoft was that this team committed themselves to delivering some of the actual bits that end up in the shipping product, which is what Jared was describing. The design integration team takes all these red lines and green lines that we were talking about, and they transform that into actual SAML and code that ends up shipping. And you guys coordinate a lot of that work with engineering, I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah. But that is something that traditionally has not happened with design teams, not only in Microsoft, but in other companies and even in design agencies. Usually designers have stopped at the Photoshop comps, right? They would deliver Photoshop comps or Illustrator comps or whatever. They would stop at delivering the flat comps. And then those comps would be given to the engineering teams or a developer to transform those visuals into the actual website, or into the actual phone application, or into the actual desktop application. And so in that transformation process, that's where things would tend to break down. Now, SAML, that's one of the things that SAML, as a markup language, it's amazing because whatever the designers craft, that's what ends up being used by the developers. Now, the lesson that I take that for me as perhaps as an independent designer or developer is that this part of design integration or transforming my visual design into SAML is super important, whether I do it by myself or I partner with someone else. But again, it just talks about the process from thinking to making. So let's talk about some ideation techniques that we can use to come up with interesting and creative ideas for apps. I also like to begin with this quote, which I'm sure we've all read before, right? But every block of stone has a statue inside it, and it's the task of the sculptor to discover it. It's a very common phrase, and it's just that that's a reality. Within this group of people that we have here in this room, I'm sure there are a lot of great application ideas that just need to be surfaced. And if you're attending tomorrow's UX design workshop, we are actually going to put in practice some of these ideation techniques. But I'm going to talk to you about some of these right now. This is the ideation process in a nutshell. It's of 3 key stages: brainstorming, exploration, and consolidation. And different agencies, different designers, they have different approaches to this. But I found these 3 kind of stages to be very actionable. So the brainstorming stage is all about giving yourself and your team full freedom to come up with ideas. It's a stage where you generate a lot of ideas, many ideas. Some of them will be random, some of them might not make a lot of sense, but you want a lot of them. This is the part where a lot of those many ideas come to place. Then you have the exploration stage. In the exploration, you will select some of these ideas and you will explore them. You will dissect them, you will test them, and you will learn from them. In the consolidation stage, you will select some of those ideas that made better sense. And notice how, of course, way less ideas will come out of here, right? But consolidation is almost kind of the opposite of brainstorming. Consolidation is about making decisions, sometimes tough decisions, because you have to detach from your personal likings for particular instead and go for what makes sense. So let's take a look at some ideas for brainstorming, which is where some of the first ideas for coming up with apps come from. So brainstorming, what are the output of brainstorming? Ideas, stories, emotions, all these things can be expressed in different ways, like mood boards and sketches and storyboards. What are the risks? Basically just one, restricting yourself or others of thinking freely and just thinking crazy about different ideas. And what are the skills needed for at this stage? Well, it's literally craziness, delusion, and just thinking outside of the box. And I'll give you some specific techniques that you can play with, because really a lot of these are like games that you can play with your teams to come up with creative ideas for apps. Now, the goal of some of these techniques that I'll share with you are to help you think outside of the box and come up with original and unique ideas for apps. What we see a lot is, when it comes to phone applications, is that we tend to think of an application idea by saying first, what APIs, we ask ourselves, what APIs are available out there? Like weather.com or CNN or Yahoo Finance. And then we say an application that exploits or that leverages that API. But we started that application idea by thinking of the technical feasibility, not by thinking about the experience of the user. We don't even know if the user really needs that information, but because the API was available, we felt it was easy. So let's come up with some ideas that don't start from that point of view. When it comes to brainstorming, there are 3 stages or sub-stages: generating ideas, relating ideas to each other, and presenting your ideas. Let's start talking about generating ideas. When it comes to generating ideas, there is a technique I like a lot of them. I'm sure many of you might know some that want to share with us, but one of them that I like is called subjects, verbs, and objects, or subject, verbs, and objects. And here what you have to do is you would have a collection of post-it notes, right, in 3 different colors. And you will ask each of the members of your team to write 3 words: 1 object, 1 verb, and 1 subject. So 1 subject, and let's, for matter of example, right, as an example, let's think that we are working on an application related to restaurants, related to the dining experience or going to a restaurant experience, right? So what would be some subjects that you can think of when going to a restaurant or going for dining? Subject could be the waiter, could be your girlfriend, could be the cook. I don't know, you guys can probably think of other ideas. Could be children or grandparents or mother-in-law. These are subjects, right? So you would write 1 subject in a post-it note and you put it on the wall. Now, 1 verb. What type of verbs or actions can you think of when going to a restaurant? Things like eating, right? Drinking, maybe celebrating, toasting, yelling. I don't know. Some people would say getting scared, because maybe you get a fly on your soup or something. I don't know. So you can come up with any sort of verb that you want. It would be da-da-da, right? Then what type of object with when you go to a restaurant? Certainly plate, food, credit card, coins. I don't know. You guys can, I'm sure you can come up with many other ideas. So we've done this exercise with many audiences, even large groups like yours, 100 people or so. And the number of ideas that come out of that group are just incredible. Here, for example, some ideas for subjects that a group in Barcelona came up with. So at the top you can see Messi, the football player. So of course it's super popular in Barcelona. So someone wrote, when we asked them about think about a restaurant, someone thought about Messi. I would have never thought about Messi myself. But that's the type of thing that you start getting when you open yourself to do brainstorming with other people. Someone wrote grandparents, kids, cook, waiter, friend, girlfriend, mother-in-law. Someone actually wrote vegetarian girlfriend. So you can start coming up with all these different ideas, right? Now, same thing for verbs, right? For verbs, there are all sorts of actions that I could not think all by myself. So what you do after that is after everyone has written their words, then you divide the team into smaller groups of people, 2 or 3, and you ask them to go to the wall and to select 3 words that speak to them, that gives them a kind of an interesting idea. So when I did that exercise, I went to the wall and I said, Messi, the player, even though it sounds like a verb or an adjective, but Messi, the player, food, play. And I was like, grandparents, food, play. And then I read kids, food, and play. And I was like, oh, interesting. When I started this exercise and thinking that I wanted to create an app, an application around restaurants or going dining, I would have never thought about this problem, which is children play with food. I don't have children, so I would have never thought about it. But it's kind of an interesting challenge to solve, right? So how could we create an application that could help us solve the problem of children playing with food? And so the next stage comes, and if you're here tomorrow, we'll go through this live, and it's actually really, really fun. The next stage is starting to test that idea. I would have never been able to come up with that idea by myself. It came out of the unconscious collective of everyone, right? So these are some techniques, kind of games that you can play with your team. One of them is called predicting the future. In predicting the future, you have 10 to go with your team of 2 or 3 people, or depending how many people you have, and you have to write quotes of your customers, thinking 6 months or 1 year ahead in time of how they would describe your application enhanced their lives. So for example, a mother would write a quote about this application. I love this application because it's very important. And then you have to, now I don't have to wash as many clothes because my children don't play anymore. Or I can actually go to better restaurants. I don't have to go to McDonald's all the time. Etc., etc. You have to be very specific. That will give you more in-depth and more insights, more in-depth information and insights on what your application could eventually get to do or solve to help people. Another set of kind of game and fun related activities here are playing with, for example, with metaphors or impossible scenarios. And people laugh a lot with this one, but let me tell you an impossible scenario related to this, right? Children play with food. Now, I could imagine I could have 2 children, right? 2 kids, and I take them to a restaurant and they play with food. But what would be an scenario? An impossible scenario would be to say, I have 100 children. What would I do as a parent if I had 100 children and I had to take them to the restaurant? Think of 100 children. I would have to somehow remember the names of everyone, all of them. Maybe by then I would have all sorts of age differences, so I would have to group. Maybe some of them will have more similar preferences to others. Some of them will be vegetarian, including the little 5-year-old who's paying attention to the older sister, and you will start like grouping them in different teams, right? And you would have to have all this information as a parent to be able to treat your children well. Now, of course, in real life, no one can have 100 kids, as far as I know. What you could have is, transporting that back to the ground, feet on the ground, is you could have a restaurant that has 100 kids at the same time. That could totally happen, right? And so if you then transport all that exploration that you did, pretending you were the parent of 100 children, transport that to the restaurant, how would you then apply all that information so that the restaurant could take care and entertain 100 children? Perhaps you end up coming up with an idea for an app which represents or enables sort of social media interaction with children, or children find out that they have similar likings between each other and they can relate and they have an area where they can play together, and maybe that's a way that you can solve this particular challenge. Let me give you another one, alternate worlds. And again, remember, these are more like games that you play with your team to come up with interesting ideas. What would be an alternate world? Well, imagine that you have children playing with food, but that this is happening in the moon, right? So if you have a meatball, right, and a kid throws a meatball, what's going to happen to that meatball? It will fly away, right? So let's transport that back now to an actual application, because we're not in the moon. But what if that gives me an idea to, I don't know, say perhaps I can create an application or a game in Windows Phone that actually allows children to play with food in the application. And maybe in the app they can actually smash food and they do all the mess that they want, and the more mess that they do, the more points they get, right? So I would have never been able to come up with that idea if I would have stayed just thinking about an app or an API or something like that. Sometimes you have to expose yourself to other type of scenarios. Relating ideas to each other is the next item. After we come up with all these crazy ideas, right, there's going to be some crazy ideas, you have to start relating them to each other. Maybe some of them will be more like games or entertainment. Maybe others will be more about helping the restaurant manager or the restaurant waiters to help serve the food, etc., etc. You have to start relating these ideas, and there are different techniques or exercises you can do for that. Something like spatial classification of ideas, which is taking those post-its and start arranging them still within the wall based on groups. That will help you identify relations and connections, and also disconnections in some of these cases. Now, presenting your ideas is the third stage, and here there's a very popular technique called pecha kucha. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that one. It means chit chat in Japanese, and this presentation technique basically says that you have only 20 slides to present, and you only have 20 seconds per slide. And the great thing about this method for brainstorming sessions is that it forces you and your team to present only what's really important, what is really actionable. It forces you to let go of kind of the extra and the fluffy stuff. So yes, even though we allowed ourselves to think crazy and come up with these crazy ideas, when you present these ideas to your team, you're forcing yourself to start filtering and to bring all these crazy ideas down to the ground. You can find more information about Pecha Kucha here in this link. It's actually now a huge organization worldwide. You can find some sample presentations and slide decks that you can download there. So when it comes to exploration, this is where we're going to start jumping into the golf application that I mentioned before. Exploration is something that you would start doing by testing some of these ideas. And you want to put some of these ideas to the test in front of users. Initially, you will probably want to do this in a very cheap way. You don't want to invest a lot of time or a lot of money, right? Time is money. You might want to do a lot of this by using sketches. You will probably not want to go all the way to Photoshop final comps. So let me jump into this one. So this is where it starts connecting to what we were saying before. Think big, right? Allow your team to come up with these ideas, filter them, and now start exploring them. Now, in the studio, one of the things that we do, many design agencies do it as well, is we start exploring the flow of an application. This is kind of, I don't know exactly what's the origin of this particular. Was this just like a creative exercise, Jared? Do you remember? Oh, it got too big. Metro map, it makes reference, of course, to the subway or underground maps. and it was trying to portray how things would flow, right? So you would be welcomed by a start screen, and you would be taken into different sections of the application. This is basically just a way to demonstrate flow. The way this is called inside of this Metro map is application flow. An application flow diagram or graphic basically helps you start exploring how your application will be flowing and how the screens will be connected. Usually that starts with something like this. I wouldn't even call these specs, but you've seen this type of Word documents before. This basically describes the different sections or functionalities or features that you're expecting to have in your application, and you start ordering them by different groups and establishing kind of a parent-child relation between them. It's just a typical document. Now that starts then being transformed into something that starts looking more like this. And I love expression design. I use expression design a lot, but many of you, I'm sure, you've used Visio before, PowerPoint. Like, all these tools help you start creating and defining the flow. So before even thinking whether we want a pivot or a panorama, or if we need a nav bar, or all those design decisions, first we start thinking about some of those ideas, those kind of crazy ideas or creative ideas that we came up with. How would those start flowing in an application? So in this case, we're saying we're going to have a main application hub called Meal Nirvana for a restaurant application, and this will have 4 different sections: restaurants, expenses, report, settings. And we start locating all these different functions that we had here in our Word file. We start picturing them in a more graphical manner. And this diagram, this flow diagram or application flow, starts evolving. We start cleaning it up and start realizing that maybe some sections could be unified into a single section. Again, we're still not thinking about pivots or panoramas or anything like that. We're just understanding the flow of the story of the user, where the user will be going through. Here it's starting to get more refined, and now we're actually starting to get a first idea of which of these elements could become pivots or pages or even panoramas. It's exactly the same, it just starts evolving. But again, there's no design, there's no visual design, it's just flow. We start identifying when a pivot would make sense, when a panorama would make sense. I'll talk more about pivots in the Golf app in a moment. Here again, it continues to evolve. Like, for example, here we can see that we will have a map control that will provide detail that will be surfaced out or will be exposed when people go to the details of a restaurant or when people go to search results of restaurants. I'm not going too much in depth here, but I just want to make the point that this is just application flow. There's no visual design. Same thing here. Here we start taking things a little bit further. You can start seeing some hints of controls, like a search box. Perhaps this is more like a list box. Here we start seeing some very early wireframes of some of the graphics. But again, I just want to communicate the concept that this is just flow. We just want to be able to start telling a story. Now this starts getting more refined little by little by understanding the information architecture of your application. And information architecture can evolve. This is another example of an application flow. This is the same thing we were looking at here in expression design. Now here, it's a little bit beyond that stage. It's more mature because now we're expressing that flow, that application flow, with wireframes. It's not final visual design, but you can now see how we have some clear indication of some buttons, text boxes, even an application bar showing up over here. So when you guys do this process, you can start going from Microsoft Word, literally, and start evolving that until you get to something like wireframes like this, like wireframes like that. Now, as I was saying initially, when you start your process, you want to do this in a very cheap way, in a very quick way. And sketching, hand sketching, will always be the fastest way to come up with some of these concepts. This is something that could take you 30 minutes if you are really thinking about it to come up with this. Whereas something like this, beautiful, gorgeous Photoshop setup, will probably take you a few days to really polish, right? So initially you might want to do this application flow that I was describing just by doing hand sketches, and then later on you can allow yourself as a developer, as a designer, to start exploring some actual visual aspects of this particular application. So let's start talking about this app that I've been mentioning throughout the session, this golf application. This was designed by Ryan, one of the designers in the team, real designer, and I'm sure he collaborated with other people. He was just telling me they had actually a couple interactions throughout a year to really put this together. But I will use this example to illustrate some of the metro concepts that we've been talking about. This is still exploration, but now we're starting to get more detailed. As you can see, we've been going from Microsoft Word to an application flow of different levels of maturity. Now we're actually going to explore visual design. And one of the tips that designers in the team recommend we follow to design applications is to think and consider our tiles from the very beginning. It's important for us to understand and define the branding for our application or our client's application, because that will reflect on the tiles and on the application itself. This is the live tile, and this is just the launch application tile for the specific app. These tiles will reflect some of the branding. For example, this particular app is green, white, and black, and we will do everything that it has to be done to defend those colors when it comes to the app. This is an interesting chart. Again, this slide is available for you to download. This is describing the live tile anatomy, which basically just describes what we had already talked about before, the fact that live tiles are made out of different layers. You have the image, you have the notification, the branding, etc., etc. You have the dimensions there and everything. So this is the welcome screen in the golf application. This is the splash screen. And you will see here we have a loader, these dots that are animated. This comes out of the box. This is a static image. Splash screen is a static image. This particular image here was most possibly treated in Photoshop. Notice how the designer emphasized or left the foreground of the image sharp and very clear, and then the background was blurred out. And so again, in Metro, by now with all these examples we've seen, you can see how there is a lot of emphasis on different levels of depth. Not as in generating 3D, but more like layers of different depth, 2D. Almost like in the old cartoon sense, right? Where you would have the background and then the foreground moving at different speeds, which is one of the concepts that Jared was sharing with us before, the parallax effect. Here, it's something like that. This is a static image, but it's trying to communicate the same concept. Also remember the concept that we talked about with the sky, right? When this image was licensed, most possibly it had a blue sky, but it was edited. So feel free, guys, to edit photos and make them match your branding. This is the menu that would welcome people into the application. We have some good touch areas in between for these particular elements, so the user will find it very easy to select some of these main options. Notice also how the designer chose to bring the same image from the background in the splash screen. He brought it here into the menu, and you can even see some Photoshop mirroring or cloning here. If you're a designer, I'm sure you noticed. But it's very interesting how this particular image was brought in here, because it also helps the user have continuity, visual continuity. So they're seeing this image and then they're taken here. And if you're a designer and you like conceptual design and metaphors, you will even notice that if we're going deeper into the application, we could argue that we're walking into this image. And so now that's why we're closer, if you're into visual metaphors. But all of that provides some continuity to the app. Now, this is one of the pivots. I've been talking a lot about panoramas. And as a reminder, panoramas are magazine cover type of controls, big spread of contents that communicate and showcase only the most important pieces of information and content of an application. Panoramas are not the best at exposing 100 different items. They're the best at exposing the top 4, the top 6 items, like a magazine cover. Now, pivots, on the other hand, these guys are great at exposing large amounts of content. They are virtualized, so they have much better performance. They can handle much better large amounts of information. Here you can have lists of 100 different items. Now, one of the common uses for pivot controls is when they are showing information from the same database or the same data source, but filtered or sorted out in different ways. For example, here, this data source are all golf courses. They're all golf courses. But each pivot in this pivot control sorts that information in different ways. Here, the golf courses are sorted by recently visited golf courses, nearby golf courses, and old golf courses. And now, on each pivot, information, even though it's presenting the same type of information, golf courses, each pivot presents information in different ways, in ways that make sense to that particular filter. So recent will simply display the list of courses and expose the date where you visited that course. Nearby talks about location, right? So it makes sense that we start exposing a map here and even mapping some of some of those courses in here. As we said before, if I tap on the map, that would take me to a full screen map control where I could see even more of those courses. And all courses, well, under the all courses filter, I could have 300 courses, right? So it would be hard for the user to scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll forever, right? So we come up, we have this thing we call a quick jump list. And so here, if you tap the letter A or the B, you will get an index with the alphabet, and you can tap on the letter, and that will take you automatically to that position in the list. So again, in summary, pivots, great controls for managing and displaying a lot of information, much better than Panorama for that. One great use is when they get information from the same data source, filtered in different ways. Now, one other aspect of pivots is they have this thing called the pivot lookup, which is this element here, which uses uppercase. Select a course. The pivot lookup is something that doesn't change between pivots. Select a course, select a course, select a course. That's basically the description of what the pivot does as a control, what this pivot does as a control. Now, a design kind of tip for you guys is that if you find it easy to come up with this phrase, a very simple phrase that describes what all this pivot, all of this does, if you find it easy, then chances are your pivot is well designed. Like in this case, select a course, it makes sense in all 3 pivots, right? If you start running into trouble coming up or describing all this pivot with a simple phrase, it is possible that maybe some of those screens or some of that information you want to expose might be better suited to be in a separate page or in a different structure, especially if you are trying to show information from the same data source. So pivot lookup is something to consider, and it's always used in uppercase letters. List view templates or list boxes. We talked about this before, very flexible, and this is what you would use to present information of different sorts. Like all of these are list box with different styles. These are the course details, and this is when we're about to get started with playing with this particular course. Now here, there are a few interesting things. This is also a pivot control. This pivot control gets information from the same data source called course information, but it presents information in different ways. It presents information about the golf course. It presents reviews about the golf course. Notice here the use of this image, very well cut out in a square. No borders or drop shadows, as we've said before. And by the way, so far you've seen that a lot of images that we use in the Windows Phone design style, a lot of the images I've shown you are always a square. And a lot of people think that all the time you have to use square images, but that's not the case really. You can, if you were using or showing things like videos or TV shows or something like that, you might have the need to expose 4:3, 16:9, or any other random type of size or proportion of images. That's totally perfect, totally allowed. The key here is to follow the grid. So you have a grid, the grid that we showed earlier. If you follow that grid, you will be fine in terms of laying out your items. You don't always have to use square-sized images. Now, these elements down here are kind of interesting. Notice we're playing with typography to show hierarchy, right? So phone is larger than the phone itself. Now, in one of these events, someone asked me, hey, why isn't the phone itself, the numbers, larger than the word phone? And that was an interesting. If you think about it today in my phone, I personally don't think I even know the phone numbers of my friends anymore. I just tap on their faces or their names, right? And I call them or I send them an email. I don't really know their phone numbers anymore. And the reality is that the phone number by itself is not that important in a smartphone anymore. What's important is communicating the fact that all this is something that's tappable. You can tap and place a phone call, or you can tap here and you can go to the map and see the location of this particular golf course, or go to the website itself. So again, this is just kind of one of those examples that show how in Metro it's important when it comes to typography to ask us what is really, really the most important thing here. Now notice down here we have an application bar with a single button. That is totally allowed. In this particular case, it's a pivot. And this application bar will be persistent. So if you go to the reviews page, this button will also be there. Now this is another pivot. This is a separate one. This has a single data source. These are golf players. No, not golf courses anymore, but golf players. And these golf players are filtered or presented in different ways, by friends, by groups, and all of them. Now here under friends, we have a first instance of a custom control. This control here does not come out of the box with the Silverlight Toolkit or the Windows SDK. This was created and designed by the designer and implemented by the developer. Here, what this control does is you select items in the list box, and these players that you choose to play with will be added to these cells over here. Now, even though this is a custom control, it matches nicely with the application, looks very Metro because it's following the grid. It has 12 pixels padding in between these elements, 24 pixels to the sides, which is what our grid tells us. It uses the branding color for our application, etc., etc. Notice also here the kind of smart use of this grid to showcase groups of players. And here we have another use of a quick jump list. This could have been alphabetical as well, but in this case it was decided to show how you could order things by locale or state. Here's a quick jump list in action. So you tap the state, have a quick jump list, you type the state, and that would scroll the list automatically. Context menu. I mentioned context menu earlier when we talked about the tap and hold gesture. Every time that you guys want to provide additional function or actions on top of an element, activate or enable the context menu. In other design languages, for example in iPhone or Android, when you have elements like this and you want to allow the user to delete them or to edit them, a lot of times we would add a little button here that says edit, another little button that says delete. That's very normal. In Windows Phone, we prefer to use things like context menus so that we can clean up the user interface, and only when the user needs and taps and holds, they get the context menu. Now, the context menu is used across all of Windows Phone, so it becomes part of the language and the part of the way that the user know they can operate the user interface. And this is the final screen, which is a confirmation. A typical question that we get here is, why is this button not in a in an application bar. It could have been in an application bar, but an application bar is probably better suited for elements or functions that need to be persistent across different pages, like different pivot items or different pages. In this case, this is a single button. There are no other screens. This is not a pivot or anything. It's just a static page. So this button works just as well. Oh, I was missing this one actually. This is another, oh, we have a question there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The question, I'll repeat the question. So the question is, just the way we have tap and hold to showcase the context menu, do we have anything like tap and hold to show a tooltip? Not out of the box. And I would think that the recommended approach is that tap and hold would only display a context menu in general. If something requires of a description, perhaps it would be better to have like a help item on the bottom of the application. It would be interesting to see a particular scenario for that. If you have any particular scenario, we can talk in the break, and then we can show people what we learned from it. Yeah, I would love to hear about that one. So finally, I think I have this screen one more, and then we'll go to a break, because I don't want to take time from Jared's session. This is another custom control. Here we needed to keep track of the hits, right, when we were playing golf. Now the first instinct of the designer was like, well, let's have this be a text box so that people can tap on the text box, the keyboard will come up, I will write a number, I will key a number, and the number will be brought in here. But if you think about it, the keyboard has also letters and symbols that we don't need in this particular scenario. We only need numbers. So the second approach was, let's just show the number keyboard that we have in phone. But that also has a couple of symbols, like it's kind of the phone keyboard, so it has a star and a hashtag that we don't really need. And so the ultimate decision for better experience was to create a custom control so that you would have these two buttons that increase or reduce the number of hits for this particular hole in the golf course. And this ended up providing the best experience for the user. Now again, this looks very metro because it's following the grid. Everything is aligned. The designer is using color to show hierarchy. So here it's green, it's red to show the player that's losing, and green to show the player that is kind of in the middle or that is currently playing. Here we have some more infographics, some out-of-the-box controls that we've been talking about before. And orientation. We talked about this before, right? Orientation, we have portrait, right landscape, and left landscape. Here, I personally thought the designer, Ryan, was super smart because instead of just thinking, hey, I will rotate this user interface and I will rearrange all these elements so that they look nice in landscape, instead of that, he asked himself, what would be a better use of landscape, a use that would make sense? And he realized that, of course, when you play golf, there's this thing called the scorecard, and it made a lot of sense to have that be used or be shown with landscape mode. And if you think about it, when it comes to implementation, sometimes it's actually easier to do something like this than force yourself to rearrange all these elements and make them look nice in vertical and horizontal mode or landscape and portrait mode. So it's always better to ask yourselves, what is landscape good for or better for versus portrait? Now, after all this exploration was done, our motion team, the motion team that Jared was describing, led by Jeff Arnold, they took a lot of these ideas and they put together this video using Adobe After Effects. I'm sure many of you are familiar with After Effects. You don't know, this is not the only way to create videos or simulations or pre-visualizations. You could use any other thing, even like Expression Blend, and I'm gonna say it, even PowerPoint. But you really can use any tool that you want to communicate and explore these ideas. So this video that I'm going to play for you It looks like an actual app, but it's not an app. It's just a mock-up video that shows the vision for the app in detail. And this is what you want to do when it comes to exploration, to explore, to allow yourself to put your ideas into a more realistic way so that you can understand if they're working or not. Notice this animation on the top, which is kind of a cheap trick because the splash is actually just a flat image. You're probably also noticing here we're now into the main pivot, the pivot that we were talking about. It's all showing golf courses coming from the same database, but each pivot item is filtering or showing that information in different ways. We're going to select one of these golf courses. Notice the tilt effect right there. We're going to learn how to implement that tilt effect with Jared in his session. Now here we're looking at that custom user control on the top. We're going to select some players, but we're first going to explore the different groups that are available for us, maybe golf players we want to play with, and these are all the players. That's a quick jump list that I was describing before that would allow you to navigate to another part of the list box without having to scroll all the way. Now here we're going to start selecting some players we want to play with today. We're going to select Arnold Palmer, and there goes his photo into this custom control on top. Jack Nicklaus. We get a text message from Tiger Woods saying he had a little bit of a car trouble, but he'll be joining us. So let's add Tiger to the list. So you can see how this list box on the bottom is scrolling, but the custom control on top is staying there. Now tap and hold, context menu, delete that player. Maybe that player is no longer our friend or no longer playing with us. Now let's go to the final screen and hit start round. And here we can see that other custom control. Notice we're going to start hitting the plus and the minus sign. Notice that little animation effect up and down. And now we're going to some of those graphics, again infographics floating on top of the background with no effects, some of the out of the box controls. And finally that orientation concept that we talked about before, which I thought it was genius from Ryan to again ask himself, I don't have to rearrange my elements to look well on landscape. Instead I will ask myself, what is landscape better for? Or what is portrait better for? So again, this was very well-refined exploration in After Effects of how the application would look like, and now we can start considering to build it, or at least now we could have feedback for the application. So in the next 2 sessions, Jared is going to take what we've been going through these few sessions. He's going to now share with us, he's going to now start taking us into how you actually produce these things in Expression Blend and even a little bit of Visual Studio. Everything that we do in Expression Blend is doable in Visual Studio, as many of you know. So he's going to get more practical. He's going to get into more like, okay, all these foundational concepts, how do you actually implement them? The next session is refine, a lot of best practices, how you implement that in Blend with SAML and C#. And then his last session, and the second session for him called Build, he's going to build a prototype end-to-end